Once upon a time, in a small town where mountains watched over trees and the trees whispered secrets to the wind, a girl named Vivian was born. Her mother, Mary, was so beautiful that even the river seemed to sparkle brighter when she walked by. Mary's beauty was like the morning sun, lighting up the whole schoolyard. Every eye, every boy, and every friend saw her and whispered her name like it was magic. But beauty, as they say, can sometimes be a trap, and it was for Mary. Her English teacher, Mr. Andy, a man with eyes like cold stones and a smile like a hidden snake, took notice of Mary. "Come and visit me at home," he said one day, his voice soft but slippery. He promised to help with her studies, but Mary, innocent as she was, didn't know that Mr. Andy's promises were hollow. When she came, Mr. Andy tricked her. She was alone with him, and his words were like a net, tangling her up until she couldn't escape. That was the day Vivian's life began, though no one knew it yet. Soon, Mary found herself pregnant. Her parents, proud and strict as palm trees, couldn't bear the shame. When they heard of the child, they turned their backs, leaving Mary with no place to go but to Mr. Andy's home. So Mary moved in with Andy, but he was not welcoming. His eyes were often cloudy, his voice rough, and he stumbled through the days, sometimes forgetting Mary was even there. In that little house, with its leaking roof and long, silent nights, Mary stayed, her heart heavy as a stone in her chest, waiting for the day her child would be born. That was how Vivian, a small girl with eyes bright as stars, came into the world. Mary's life with Andy was like a long, dark night without stars. She carried her heavy belly alone in that broken house. Andy, always stumbling and reeking of sour palm wine, barely noticed her. Each night, he would go out to laugh and drink until he was more shadow than man. When he came home, he would collapse like a fallen tree, his eyes foggy and his voice booming like thunder in a storm. Mary sat alone, her hands resting on her belly, whispering soft words to the child inside. "One day, you will see the sun," she said, her voice a gentle breeze in the quiet night. She dreamed of a better life for her child, away from Andy's carelessness, away from the noise and the smells. But dreams are only dreams, and for Mary, each day felt heavier than the last. Then, like a bright morning after a stormy night, Vivian was born. Her skin was as soft as flower petals, and her eyes sparkled, deep and bright, just like her mother's. People said she was beautiful, even as a baby. Mary held her close, her heart swelling with love mixed with worry. "Andy," she whispered one night as Vivian lay sleeping, "our daughter deserves more. She needs care, warmth, love." But Andy only grunted, his mind lost in drunken haze. His care for Vivian was as thin as smoke, slipping away before it could settle. Mary knew, deep down, that this house, with its broken roof and broken promises, was no place for Vivian. Mary's heart ached as she watched her daughter grow, knowing that her love alone couldn't protect Vivian from Andy's careless ways. She looked at her daughter, tiny and innocent, and decided she would find a way. Mary knew she couldn't give Vivian the life she deserved in Andy's house, so one day, with a heart both heavy and hopeful, she carried Vivian to her grandparents' home. Mr. David, Vivian's grandfather, welcomed the little girl with open arms. He was known throughout the town, tall, wise, and as sturdy as an old tree. His voice was like a deep drumbeat, and people respected him, for he was a man of few words but many lessons. Vivian grew up under his watchful eye, a curious and quiet child, studying her grandfather closely and learning the rhythm of his days. Mr. David would sit in his wooden chair under the tree, his eyes fixed on the distance, always deep in thought. He was strict but gentle, guiding her with a steady hand. Yet, like a hidden stream beneath the soil, Mr. David had a secret. When the sun dipped low and the town quieted, he would take out a small cigarette, roll it carefully, and light it, letting the smoke drift up like whispers to the sky. Vivian, small and curious, often peeked from the corner of the room, watching as the smoke curled from his mouth and nose. She didn't understand it, but she was fascinated, her young mind wrapped in the mystery of it all. Life in the town moved slowly, like the river curving around the trees. Now Vivien played with the other children, ran through the fields, and helped Mr. David fetch water from the well. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, and her laughter was as light as the morning breeze. Vivien's heart was like a sponge, soaking in everything around her. She loved her grandfather, respected him, and even imitated the way he held his head high. In those quiet moments, watching him puff on his cigarette, a tiny spark of curiosity began to flicker in her heart, though she didn't yet know what it meant. Behind Mr. David's house, a group of young men gathered every afternoon, their voices loud with laughter and their hands holding cups filled with drink. They sat in a circle, sharing cigarettes, the smoke curling around them like tiny clouds. They laughed, joked, and sometimes argued, their voices bouncing through the air. Vivien, with her curious eyes and quiet footsteps, would slip behind the bushes to watch them. The way they held their cigarettes and blew smoke from their mouths and noses reminded her of her father, Andy, back when she was little. Now she watched the smoke dance around these men, curious and captivated. Their faces glowed with a strange joy she didn't quite understand, but something about the way the smoke floated and swirled held her like a spell. She would stay hidden, crouched like a little rabbit, her eyes wide as she watched the men make rings with their smoke. Sometimes she even saw one of them puff out 2 streams of smoke, one from each nostril, like a dragon from the tales Mr. David would tell her. The men never noticed her peeping, they were too caught up in their own world, laughing and passing the cigarettes around. And with each passing day, Vivien's curiosity grew. The smoke, the laughter, the mystery of it all, it stayed with her like a little ember glowing in her mind, leaving a mark that would one day call to her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. One bright afternoon, as Vivien was playing near her home, the young men behind Mr. David's house spotted her. They waved her over, laughing and calling her name. "Vivien, come here, little one of them said, grinning. Eager to help, Vivien ran up to them, her eyes curious and wide. "Can you do us a small favor?" another asked, holding out a few coins. "Get us some cigarettes from the town shop, will you?" Vivien nodded quickly, taking the coins in her tiny hands and feeling proud to be trusted with such an errand. She dashed off to the shop, her feet swift on the dusty path. When she returned with the cigarettes, the men thanked her with big smiles, ruffling her hair and calling her a good girl. Their laughter filled her heart with warmth, like she'd done something important. Soon, this small favor turned into a regular task. "Vivien, get us some cigarettes, will you?" they'd call out, tossing her coins, knowing she would always help. And each time, Vivien would run off, her feet quick and her heart eager. Over time, the smell of the cigarettes became familiar, like the scent of firewood or the flowers by the river. She came to recognize the crinkle of the paper, the light scratch of the matchstick, the first puff that curled into the air. The cigarettes, the smoke, the men's laughter, all of it became part of her world, woven into the little tasks she gladly performed each day. As Vivien ran these errands, the sight of cigarettes nestled in her small hands felt like holding a secret. She'd watched the men light up, taking slow, thoughtful puffs, their faces calm and focused as the smoke rose like gentle clouds. Even her father, Andy, used to do the same, and her strict grandfather would sometimes sit quietly, puffing on his cigarette in the evening. She noticed how the smoke seemed to wrap around their thoughts, like it held something magical, something only grown-ups understood. What is it about this smoke, she wondered, her heart buzzing with curiosity. Why do they enjoy it so much? The more she watched, the more questions danced through her young mind. One quiet night, when the town was wrapped in shadows, Mr. David sat inside the house, his face tight with anger. He had quarreled with a neighbor earlier, and his heart felt heavy, like a stone. Without thinking, he took out his cigarette, rolling it between his fingers before lighting it. He forgot to lock the door, the small click that usually kept his secret safe. Vivien, watching quietly from her corner, noticed the soft glow of his cigarette lighting up the room. She crept closer, her small footsteps silent as a mouse, her eyes wide as she watched her grandfather. He was puffing quickly, his lips tight, the smoke swirling thickly around him like storm clouds. She had never seen Mr. David look this way before. His eyes were dark, his brow furrowed, and he let out a long, heavy sigh. With each puff, the smoke seemed to carry his anger into the air, floating like little whispers that vanished into the night. Vivien thought to herself, maybe smoking is what grown-ups do when they're upset. Maybe it helps take away the bad feelings. She watched as the smoke curled and danced, and slowly, Mr. David's face softened, bit by bit, as if the anger were slipping away with each puff. That night, the idea planted itself firmly in her young heart. She didn't understand everything, but she believed she had found a piece of the secret. Smoking was something people did when things weren't right, when their hearts were stormy, just like her grandfather's had been. In her little mind, the thought grew roots, linking smoke to calming storms, a habit to soothe the raging rivers inside. By the time Vivien reached 13, her curiosity had grown into a deep thirst she couldn't ignore. The image of Mr. David puffing away his anger, the young men laughing as smoke curled around them, it all played in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. One day, as she wandered behind Mr. David's house, she noticed a few cigarette butts left on the ground, forgotten by the young men. She picked one up, turning it over in her fingers, feeling the rough paper, the ash smeared along its edges. A thrill ran through her. She quickly tucked it into her pocket, glancing around to make sure no one saw her. Day by day, she began gathering these little scraps, her secret collection growing as she carefully wrapped each piece in an old cloth she hid under her bed. She imagined the moment she would finally try it, wondering if the smoke would taste as mysterious as it looked or if it would bring her the strange feeling she had seen in others. Her curiosity grew like a small fire inside her, flickering brighter each time she thought of lighting one of those scraps. And so, with her hidden collection and her heart brimming with anticipation, Vivien waited for the day she would finally discover what the smoke truly felt like. One quiet afternoon, with the house empty, Vivien's curiosity burned like a tiny flame. She slipped quietly into Mr. David's room, her small feet careful not to make a sound. Her eyes darted around the dim room until she spotted something, a small bowl tucked away in the corner, holding a dry, ground-up substance that looked like crushed leaves. She tiptoed closer, her heart pounding. She'd seen Mr. David use this before, mixing it carefully and smoking it slowly. The smell was sharp, strange, and powerful. Without fully understanding, she decided to try it herself, feeling a thrill that made her hand shake. She tore a sheet from her notebook, spreading it out flat, and carefully scooped the dry leaves into the paper, rolling it the way she'd seen others do. What Vivien didn't know was that Mr. David had mixed something strong into this bowl, a blend of hard drugs and weed. But in her innocent eyes, it was simply the mystery she had been drawn to, something only adults seemed to understand. With the paper twisted into a rough roll, she struck a match and lit the end. She brought it to her lips, her small hands trembling as she took a cautious puff. The smoke hit her throat like fire, harsh and biting, making her cough as her eyes watered. But she pushed through, wanting to feel what the others did. Moments later, a heavy dizziness washed over her, the room spinning like leaves caught in a whirlwind. Her legs wobbled, and she stumbled back, her head clouded with a strange, overwhelming fog. The world around her grew dim, and she felt herself falling, her small body crumpling to the floor. She lay there, still and silent, her breathing shallow as her young body tried to make sense of the powerful, dangerous substance. As the smoke hung in the air, Vivien drifted into darkness, unaware of the trouble her innocent curiosity had brought her into. Just then, Mr. David, passing by her room, caught a strange smell, the faint, unmistakable scent of burning paper. His heart skipped a beat. He pushed open the door, eyes wide, and there, lying pale and limp on the floor, was Vivien, clutching her makeshift cigarette. Her small frame looked so fragile, her face so still, that his heart squeezed with fear. "Vivien," he cried, rushing to her side. His hands shook as he picked up the burnt paper, quickly tossing it to the ground. The shock on his face was like thunder, he could barely believe what he was seeing. Without wasting a moment, he scooped her up in his arms, her body limp like a broken doll. The worry in his eyes was as deep as the river, and his steps were quick and strong as he carried her through the town, calling out for help. The townspeople turned their heads, whispering, their faces filled with concern as they watched the once mighty Mr. David, now a frightened grandfather, rushing his beloved Vivien to the hospital. He placed her gently on the hospital bed, his heart pounding as the healers gathered around. As he watched them work, his own heart felt as heavy as a stone, the fear of losing her like a shadow that wouldn't let go. When Mary heard the news, she rushed to the hospital, her heart feeling like it was tearing. Each step felt heavier than the last as she made her way to her daughter's side. When she reached the small room, there lay Vivien, pale and fragile, her little chest rising and falling slowly. Mary's eyes filled with tears, each drop a weight of worry, guilt, and love. "Vivien, my little girl," she whispered, brushing her fingers softly over her daughter's hand. Even Andy, who had drifted far from family matters, arrived, his face filled with a mix of regret and concern. He stood at the foot of the bed, looking down at Vivien with heavy eyes. He hadn't been there for her in the ways he should have, and the sight of his daughter lying so still tugged at something deep inside him. For days, Vivien lay quietly, her small body recovering from the shock. Mr. David never left her side, his face lined with worry, his mind replaying the moment he found her, the smell of smoke and fear still fresh in his memory. Finally one morning, Vivien's eyes fluttered open. She looked up to see her mother, her grandfather, and even her father watching over her. A small, weak smile touched her lips, and her voice was soft as a whisper. Mary held her hand, relief flooding over her. "My child, why did you do this?" she asked gently, her voice trembling. Vivien looked down, her young face thoughtful, as if searching for the right words. "I thought smoking was what people did when they felt sad or angry," she said quietly. "I saw Father, I saw Grandpa, and even the boys behind the house. I thought it was something that would help me feel strong." Mr. David closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing on him like a heavy stone. Mary hugged Vivien close, her tears falling like rain. She promised herself that she would protect her daughter, that she would guide her so Vivien would never feel the need to seek strength in smoke or shadows again. Andy, silent but tearful, stood by, feeling the sting of his own failings and hoping, somehow, to make things right for his little girl. Word of Vivien's smoking spread through the town like the wind, touching every corner, every household, and every ear. The people murmured with shock and concern, and soon the elders called a gathering under the big tree, where all important matters were discussed. The elders, wise and stern, looked over the crowd, their faces heavy with disappointment. They called forth the young men who had spent their days smoking behind Mr. David's house, their faces now lowered in shame. The eldest among the leaders, his voice like thunder, spoke gravely. "Young men, look at the harm your carelessness has caused. Children see more than we know, they learn from what they watch. How can we allow such things to happen to the innocent in our town?" The young men nodded, their heads hung low as the elder continued, his words like arrows hitting their mark. He warned everyone about the dangers of setting poor examples for children, reminding them that the young are like clay, easily molded by what they see around them. To protect the town's future, the elders declared, from this day forward, smoking shall not be done openly in the town again. We will not let our children be drawn into habits that harm them. The people nodded in agreement, their hearts heavy with the lessons they had learned. They looked around at one another, each person silently vowing to protect the innocence of the children and to guide them wisely, knowing that the eyes of the young were always watching, always learning. When Vivien finally returned home, Mary's promise lingered in the air. Andy, standing by with a look of regret in his eyes, reached down and held his daughter's other hand. For the first time, he saw clearly the path his choices had set before her, and he knew things had to change. From now on, Vivien, Andy spoke softly, I will be the father you deserve. I'll leave those bad habits far behind. His voice was steady, yet full of remorse. Mary, too, felt a newfound strength in her heart. Together, they would rebuild their family, one careful step at a time. They made a quiet pact to shield Vivien from the mistakes of the past and to fill her days with love, warmth, and guidance. The whole town had learned from Vivien's story. Her journey became a tale told to children, a gentle warning about the power of example. It became an unspoken rule, a shield of protection for the town's young hearts and minds. As time went on, Vivien grew up in a home full of hope and change. Her parents, now closer than ever, worked together to give her a safe place to grow. United by this lesson, the town stood watch over all their children. I hope you enjoyed the tale. If so, please like the video, share it with your family and friends, comment on it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell for more enchanting tales like this one. Goodbye.